So tonight's chapter is titled Property's International Empire. The book is How Wealth Rules the World. And frankly, I don't get into too much of the world until later in the book. In the last chapter, the last time we got together in December, we talked about a chapter, and it's on debt, and it was called Creditors and Cannibals. And we talked about, as we have throughout, the fact that ownership of property and wealth in particular, a lot of property or land, has always been the measure by which rights were divvied out, if you will. If you didn't have any property, like homeless people, for instance, your rights are not really visible. They can't be exercised readily. We talked about that aspect of it. Mentioned Alexander Hamilton again early on in the book. Talked about Hamilton and his plan for creating really an empire in North America, and using debt as the tool, the economic tool to drive things forward, to turn the United States, the new nation, into a real economic power. And through debt, that was his plan. And it's been one that has been codified in American law ever since. And we talked about really what this model for an economy, supposed economy, looked at what it looks like, how it acts, and was characterized by Jack Forbes, a Native American scholar. He characterized it as Wetiko, which is a Algonquin word for a demon that kind of personifies greed and accumulation and destruction. And so cannibalism was his way of critiquing the capitalist system, the extract, consume, dispose process. And we also talked a bit about the most, I guess, notorious form of general debt these days, and that's student debt. The fact that young people wanting to get an education, go to college, hoping to better themselves and increase their possibilities for a good career and so forth, end up going into deep debt, and only the successful and those graduating into high-paying jobs are able to escape from it, and the rest really are making up a generation of indentured, well, the young now, but it's their whole lives. They're going to be paying off that debt, which doesn't sound like indentureship until you figure that the wages they earn in the future, that money will go to the creditors, not to go to support their families or their aspirations. And so it really is kind of a crypto form of indentureship. So tonight we're going to move on to this chapter, and it's titled Property's International Empire. And I'll go ahead and read from it some and pause in between the subsections and ask for any comments or questions. You recall that you can raise your hand, and I will try diligently to notice that they're raised. Let's get started. So I generally start with a quote, and this one is from John Kenneth Galbraith, who's an economist, and this is his quote: "Under capitalism, man exploits man. Under communism, it's just the opposite." And it's supposed to be a little chuckle. So the first section we're going to cover is Old Habits Die Hard. European imperialism caused the dissolution and genocide of whole cultures throughout the world. The history of imperialism, colonialism, mercantilism, and empire suggest it was superior technology that allowed Europeans to conquer and expropriate whole continents from the rest of the original human diaspora. But not until the meme of property infected the canon of law, where muskets, cannons, and seaworthy vessels turned against the rest of humanity and the whole planet. Most successful of the European empires was one with a self-aggrandizing name, Great Britain. It was a matter of enduring pride for an Englishman to say that, quote, the sun never sets on the British Empire, end quote. Today, nations that once were part of that world-spanning domain, including Canada, Australia, India, and 50 others, form the Commonwealth of Nations. To varying degrees, their post-colonial administrations emulate the British parliamentarian form. The United States is a former colony of the empire, but not a member of the Commonwealth of Nations. It broke its colonial bonds and declared its aspirations for a new kind of government based on the popular will and the protection of unalienable rights. Revolutionaries questioned the use of law to perpetuate excessive privileges in governing for the hoarding class. But the Federalists who betrayed those revolutionary aspirations conspired to impose a constitution that differs only superficially from Britain's class-based model of government. As a result, the special relationship established between England and America in later years is best understood as a shared commitment to perpetuating aristocratic privileges for the wealthiest of men. Nations that emulate the British and the Federalist systems of government share in that commitment. The United States Constitution established a tax-free zone for trade and wealth creation in North America. It removed trade barriers between the 13 sovereign states that for a generation were a confederacy of nations after the Revolution. It abolished their sovereignty for the sake of unfettered interstate and international commerce. As such, it became a model emulated by new nations coming out of the mercantilist colonialism. It isn't surprising that leaders of the Commonwealth of Nations and protégés of American constitutionalism have been busy creating global so-called free trade agreements to amplify the power of a minority-controlled worldwide web of wealth. But it hasn't been only ex-colonies of Britain. Jeremy Lent, in his The Patterning Instinct, argues that, quote, especially since the mid-20th century, what had once been the Western worldview has now become the dominant worldview of those in positions of wealth and power who drive our global civilization from Bangkok to Beijing and from Mumbai to Mexico City, end quote. The secretly negotiated so-called trade compacts that they devise, much as the American Constitution, constrain popular governance over the uses and abuses of wealth in its many forms. These multilateral accords are more akin to contracts than to constitutions. They turn international law into a type of private law that can be invoked by wealthy parties and enforced by unelected tribunals. They facilitate the privatization of member states' domestic governments and resources. At the same time, they protect the property class from democratic meddling by the rest of humanity. And that's the end of that short section. Are there any comments, any questions, thoughts? Okay, we'll move on to the next subsection, and it is titled, Who Profits? Question. Cui bono? The underlying premises of international trade have changed over the centuries, from the age of competition for colonies among European nations to the nationalist agenda of mercantilism and protectionism. The world has emerged into the age of globalization. The underlying premise of this new international arrangement is the integration of markets, borderless exchange of capital, and relocation of manufacturing and services in pursuit of cheap labor. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, was established in 1995 and signed by 159 nations, replacing the earlier General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which had operated since 1948. Although there's a bit of language in the preamble to the WTO agreement calling for, quote, raising standards of living, ensuring full employment, and a large demand, and expanding the production of and trade in goods and services, end quote, it all boils down to opening new markets for corporations that are capitalized enough to engage in foreign trade. Much of the agreement focuses on protecting the equality of member nations and constituent corporate bodies in terms of taxes and duties, quotas on imports and exports, restrictions on domestic subsidies, simplification of import licensing, limitations on domestic anti-dumping measures, and the sanctity of property rights, including intellectual property. The Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, the TBT, is part of the WTO regime. The Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade governs and so-called harmonizes domestic regulations with international standards. Regulation is set by member nations for domestic products and processes, including standards for manufacturing and quality control, environmental protection, and safety regulations are nullified. Standards secured through citizens' demands for the protection of customers, communities, and nature are subordinated to the commercial dictates of the WTO agreement, which places them into the category of unnecessary trade barriers. So, unnecessary trade barriers, in other words, barriers to trade are anything that interferes with the profit-making motive. And if it protects the communities, well, that's a blockage to trade. The TBT is the international version of ceiling preemption that we've talked about before, applied domestically to every state and local government of the member nations. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the U.S. has so-called free trade agreements with 20 nations. The North American Trade Agreement, NAFTA, a pact eliminating tariffs and quotas between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, has been in effect since 1994. And at the time of this writing, at the time I was writing the book, that is, the NAFTA was being negotiated by the Trump administration, renegotiated. The details of an Asia-Pacific trade agreement known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, have been negotiated, although not implemented by the U.S., and discussions continue over the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, with the European Union. According to Ronald D. Rotunda and John E. Nowak in their treatise on constitutional law, substance, and procedure, even though, quote, the U.S. Supreme Court is the most powerful court the world has ever known, the investor-state dispute settlements, the ISDS provisions of WTO, NAFTA, TPP, and other international agreements can supersede decisions of the highest national courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, and there is no appeal. The implications for the rights of people are substantial because the rights of property and the interests of the property class get direct representation in negotiations over international trade policies and free trade agreements, while the interests of communities and the freedoms characterized as unalienable rights of people are generally seen as irrelevant to trade or are made the subject of side agreements to trade pacts. They are akin to the U.S. Bill of Rights that applied to no one who didn't already have rights when they were adopted. The Federalists' example of vesting the right to govern within privileged property like slaves and corporations, and allowing that power to be transferred through the objects of wealth to the owners, has been emulated internationally. On a global scale, the WTO plays the role of the U.S. Congress in its capacity as sole arbiter of what constitutes cross-border commerce. the Constitution's Commerce Clause has been cloned and public governance of the so-called private sector neutralized. Corporations, investments, patents, and copyrights convey to their owners the privilege of representation by trade tribunals. The effect has been the privatization of decision-making regarding regulation of industrial activities, environmental impacts, and popular participation at all levels. Local and state laws that conflict with international trade treaties are subject to preemption by unelected and unknown people representing the interests of the property class. And that's the end of that section. Do we have Heidi? You have a question or a comment?
Yeah, hi, sorry. I finished my dinner now, so I'm back on screen. I've been following it with a book, and have you done some editing?
Oh, there is a little difference, actually. And so, I'm going to make you read the book. See that? No, that's not. I'm actually working off of my manuscript. And so there was some playing around with the language and a couple of changes here and there in the book when it went to print. So what you're getting is, in some ways, the unscrubbed manuscript.
Oh,
Okay. So there is a little bit of difference. Did you see anything significant that you needed to bring to the front here?
Oh, it was quite a lot different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to follow you, and then, I'd have to go a little further on.
Yeah, it's the
I would love to have a more intelligent question than that, but it's just so over my head. And I think I've read this a couple times now, and it's still like, it's crazy making.
well, you're not the only one, and me too. Me too, in many ways, because sometimes I think, why do we try to make sense of things that are insane? But I mean, they're sane within a certain narrow point of view, which is don't worry about the commoners, just let's take care of the people who matter. That's the underlying essence, the message, I think. And if you want to follow along with what I'm actually looking at, it's the PDF files that were uploaded onto our website that you can read along. Yeah, the book, it does have a couple of changes in it. They don't change the overall thrust of the message. Okay, I see another hand up. Boy, it's hard to see those things.
Yeah, hi. I just want to endorse what Heidi said. And I think maybe because it's all a house of cards, it has no basis in existence, in reality. It's not grounded. It's literally not in soil. And so you're entering into someone's fantasy, which has been shared by millions of people by now. But if you're not like in the fantasy, then it just looks very strange.
You're making an extremely important and good point, I think. And that is that I think we can characterize that fantasy that people are brought into as it's really a kind of a society-wide psychosis. And we're mad, or we're under hypnosis, or a spell, if you want to talk magically, or however you want to characterize it. But you're very much to the point to say it doesn't have any connection to the real world, to reality. When I say reality, I'm cautious because I think people have lots of different versions of reality dancing around in their heads, and that's fine. We're all individuals. We all have different ways of seeing the world. But when I think of this has no connection to the real world, I'm going to define reality in a very general sense. And I'm stealing this from an author I read many years ago, Robert Anton Wilson. And he said, reality is whatever, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Now think about it. There's nothing about the WTO or the NAFTA or TPP or international trade agreements that if everybody stopped believing in them, would they still be there? No, neither would money. Neither would corporations. So,
I'm sorry, Ben, could you repeat his name again, please? Robert?
Robert Anton Wilson. He's not exactly like a scholar in these. He was somebody who played around with, and these days it's an interesting topic, but he played around with the idea of conspiracy theories and how they latch onto people's minds.
Mm, interesting, thank you.
And he did it in a satirical way, which is why I liked it a lot. It was fun. But at any rate, so yeah, your point is really well taken, and I think important that we have to remember that we're living within somebody's kind of video game, fantasy world, however you want to call it. It's not connected to the real empirical world in any way. And early on in discussing how wealth rules, I talked about property and where does it come from? Well, we talked about the Pope Alexander VI, his line on the old map of the Western Hemisphere. And that line became a law, and it divided the Western Hemisphere between Portugal and Spain. Well, there's nothing real about that line. There's nothing real about that property, that claim to land, or any other property line, or any other national border. They can't be seen from space, from orbit. They're not there. And so we may mutually agree to certain things like this is my potato crop and I should be able to harvest it, not you. That's one thing. But the idea of lines on the map and dividing up the surface of the planet into monopolized control that we call property, it's pretty much the basis for the general paranoia or neurosis or whatever it is that's taken hold of us these days.
As distinct from indigeneity and their cosmologies which are literally grounded. I think Daniel Wildcat refers to relatives, not resources. Like we have a relationship with the biosphere as relatives, not resources to be extracted.
Exactly.
And that's real. That's, if you take everything away that you believe, but that's still there.
You still have a relationship, whether it's a good one or a bad one, it's still there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Sabine, do you have a question? There you are.
I have a question. How did they get 150 countries to sign up for this? I mean, for the World Trade WTO, knowing that they are giving up an enormous amount of their autonomy.
I think that it depends on the country that you're talking about, and there are various ways. But I know that one of the reasons I would say that this nation and its leaders don't mind cozying up to dictators and autocrats in other countries is that they don't mind taking out large loans from the international banking and so forth, taking out those loans and putting up as collateral the natural resources of the country and also the social programs that have been put up. And so then, as we'll see shortly here as we get into it, that some of the restrictions and the rollback of social programs is about the international debt. If you have an autocrat running a country who just wants to bring in money for himself and his own power. So you can borrow against using the name of the country the country you're supposed to represent, enrich yourself, and leave the nation with the responsibility to pay back the loan, which may be in the billions of dollars. And how do they pay back the loan when they don't have cash? Well, they open up their borders and they say, come in, get our oil, get our gold, get whatever we have. That's globalization.
But it's not only the countries that have dictators, also the so-called democracy signed on.
Well, so-called is a good catch there. I agree with that. But and there is, I'm sure, some sense of that through these agreements they can reduce obstacles to trade, and obstacles to trade means that maybe there's more profits can be made within that nation. But whether or not that actually ends up serving the population of that country or just its captains of industries is another issue. And it's the captains of industries who get to make those trade agreements. So we can imagine who they benefit. I hope that somewhat answered your question. So I'll move on to the next section, and it is titled, It's the Same Around the World. At the height of what was prematurely dubbed the Arab Spring, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, quote, I would not look to the U.S. Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in the year 2012. I might look at the Constitution of South Africa. That was a deliberate attempt to have a fundamental instrument of government that embraced basic human rights, end quote. Justice Ginsburg rightly noticed that unlike the U.S. Constitution, which tacked on the Bill of Rights as an afterthought, South Africa made human rights a more central element of their frame of government. But can those rights stand up to the rest of the document's reverence for the rights wrapped up in wealth? Justice Ginsburg either missed or was not concerned by the 1993 South African Constitution's enthronement of rights for corporations. In a letter to the people of South Africa, Ralph Nader wrote, quote, South Africa's new constitution establishes that juristic persons are entitled to the rights in the Bill of Rights to the extent required by the nature of the rights and of the juristic persons. The American experience of providing corporations with similar rights that people should, I'm sorry, I'll start back on that sentence. The American experience of providing corporations with similar rights that people have should ring alarm bells for South Africans concerned about preserving their newly won freedoms. While the U.S. Constitution does not explicitly afford corporations the rights guaranteed in our Bill of Rights, court decisions have extended almost all those rights to the corporate elite entities with disturbing results, end quote, from Ralph Nader. South Africa's constitution is exceptional in its unapologetic recognition of rights for property. Even the U.S. Constitution did not recognize corporations as rights-bearing entities until judges without democratic responsibility to the people saw things differently. Around the globe, other nations have created other devices to arrive at the same conclusion. Those who own wealth should be given exponentially greater governing authority than those who do not. Mila Versteeg is an associate law professor at the University of Virginia. While she was at Oxford, she reportedly read all 186 national constitutions enacted since the Second World War. She, her colleague, David Law, professor of law at Washington University, have since studied those constitutions, and in 2012, they published a paper titled The Declining Influence of the United States Constitution. The New York Times reported on their work recounting that, quote, in 1987, on the Constitution's bicentennial, Time magazine calculated that of the 170 countries that exist today, more than 160 have written charters modeled directly or indirectly on the US version. A quarter century later, the picture looks very different. The US Constitution appears to be losing its appeal as a model for constitutional drafters everywhere. The Times went on to notice that nations replace their constitution on average every 19 years, which is precisely what Thomas Jefferson advised in a 1789 letter to James Madison, because, as he put it, the earth belongs always to the living generation. Asked by interviewer Rob Kahl if the Constitution's Versteeg and Law studied gave corporate property similar rights to people, Versteeg replied, quote, "I'm pretty sure that none of them do," end quote. Their research predated South Africa's 1993 constitutional language about juristic persons. Nader got that one right. And he was also right to say that corporate rights can be found in the or can't be found in the US Constitution, except by corporate lawyers who've gotten political appointments and to the Supreme Court. But around the world, and in the US, rights vested in privileged property and conveyed to the owners of that property are common. They're couched in case law, statutes, and treaties, if not in constitutions. A global campaign to remove the power of public governance to exert control over commerce, that is, the redistribution of assets from the unbanked and underbanked to the wealthy, and the economy has been raging for decades, even though matters of extraction, production, labor, and trade have direct impacts on everyone. They are more and more being codified as private and not public concerns. International trade laws and treaties around the world do for the global aristocracy of wealth what the Commerce Clause does for the property class in the United States. They privatize matters of legitimate public concern and democratic governance. That's the end of that subsection there. Any thoughts, questions, comments? Okay, moving on. It just gets better and better for the wealthy. Hernando de Soto, president of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, reported glowingly that, quote, "The slow and steady improvement of property rights continues unabated. This year, the world property rights average improved 3.45% to 5.63, whatever that means. In 2017, International Property Rights Index added a set of liberty measures to evaluate how property rights impact the whole of society. The findings are striking. The legal and political environment was found to have the highest correlations with entrepreneurship and network readiness, a measure of liberty. And it's interesting that no matter how they try to reform or humanize these agreements and these laws, the measure of liberty is still based on the ability to accumulate property. That is what liberty is understood to be these days. According to Julian G. Koo, quote, "It has almost become conventional wisdom among international human rights scholars that corporations should be treated as full subjects under international law. This view has developed largely from the extensive academic literature. Corporations never achieved direct rights under international law until the post-war development of international investment law. Corporate rights were granted in such treaties by specific textual references and therefore never generated much controversy." In other words, rather than coming out blatantly and saying that corporations have human rights, they simply put those rights in the text, kind of hid it in the flow of the narrative in these agreements. And therefore, kind of avoided the public controversy they might otherwise have had generated. When international treaties treat corporate property as full subjects under international law, privileged property is vested with rights transferable to the owners. Koo suggests that corporations might better be held accountable for human rights violations if they are declared subjects with legal agency. In fact, this ruse would further immunize the property class from personal liability for the oppressive ways they use their property. So there were apologists for this idea of recognizing corporate rights internationally who said, look, we can hold corporations responsible this way. If we recognize them as persons with rights, we can also sue them for violating rights. But it really doesn't work out that way. In effect, the rights that are recognized and attached to the corporations are used as battering rams against human beings who supposedly have rights, but never get to exercise them in a contest with corporate property. Moving on, the global aristocracy of wealth has been empowered to act with impunity. This is in accord with how we understand the undeclared American aristocracy gained and uses its extra privileges under the law in the United States. Rather than clearly stating within foundational documents the legal default giving supremacy to the rights of property, specific textual references to corporations as proprietary vessels able to convey sheltered rights were employed. In 2011, Jose E. Alvarez wrote that, quote, focusing on whether or not a corporation is a subject under international law, subject like a human subject, that is, under international law or an international legal person, is at best a distraction, and that affirmative decisions to this effect may be a very bad idea. Contrary to what many human rights advocates apparently believe, those who want to hold corporations accountable for international law violations should not be too quick to assume that they want corporations to be subjects of international law. So the irony is that it was human rights activists that were arguing that corporations should be internationally recognized as juristic persons, as though they could then be held responsible for their actions. Even the ACLU here in the US argue and have argued vehemently in court in favor of corporate rights because they kind of have as their mission the protection of constitutional rights. And then somehow they had a difficulty separating the idea of constitutional rights for property versus constitutional rights for people. The global battle being waged for the rights of property against the rights of people mimics US tactics for protecting privileged property from responsibility to the larger community. In litigation brought within nation states, the central government of the wealthy minority hiding behind corporate property and asserting its rights are increasingly allied against their middling peasant class and the poor. As Juliette Renaud, corporate accountability campaigner for Friends of the Earth France, put it, quote, effective protection of human rights and environmental defenders cannot be achieved if the responsibility of one of the main perpetrators of such violations is evaded. An international tribunal and effective mechanisms of sanctions for transnational corporations are needed to prevent big companies hiding behind investment protection agreements and the legal personality of their subsidiaries to continue behaving with impunity. That said, neither the U.S. Supreme Court nor any international tribunal is being compelled to subject the privatized rights of property to public law. Meanwhile, in America and abroad, the private law of contracts and the establishment of corporate safe zones comprised of international treaties and reciprocal judicial accommodations are enforced as public law without public recourse or input. Business instruments chartered by public governments, are borne onto the global stage, immune from control by the people in whose name they were created, or the foreigners whose lives they wound. I think the essence of this is really that what the U.S. Pioneered in the new nation with the Commerce Clause and the Contracts Clause and corporate personhood and so forth has been internationalized, and at least the investor class seems to enjoy it quite a lot. I'll be moving on. Go ahead. Question?
Yeah, would you go back to the quoting De Soto, the
Okay.
president of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy?
Mhm.
And especially the last sentence, I don't know what network readiness is, and it's language I don't follow as a measure of liberty. Could you put that in other words, what that quote is saying? You could go earlier in the quote and sort of.
I could try, but frankly, this is their words, and some of it is obfuscating. But yeah, it says the legal and political environment was found to have the highest correlations with entrepreneurship and network readiness, a measure of liberty. They're equating the ability to, to engage in international trade, to use your property to increase your wealth, as how we are going to create a measure, a metric for liberty, which is not how human beings would measure liberty, I don't think. It's certainly not how Tom Paine would. It's certainly not how Jefferson would have written about it, I don't think. He was not exactly a champion of liberty for everybody, but obviously not. But now it's what's blatant. It's very blatant, I think, is the thing. It's kind of astonishing how blatant it is. But it's not that unusual. When I listen to business reports, so-called news programs, and they give you the news about how the Dow Jones Industrials are doing or whatever it is, they talk like this too. It is about and when you hear the politicians talking about making sure that we're competitive worldwide and the rest of it, they're equating that with American liberty and freedom and the rest. It leaves out a large portion of the human race.
Yeah,
who aren't participants in this so-called network.
and it brings to mind that that people that own stocks can actually sue the managers of the stocks if they make a decision about investment and they consider anything else than the bottom line profits that are made. That a stockholder can sue the investor if they consider human rights, environmental rights, or any other labor rights or anything like that.
And why do you think that that rule hasn't been changed when it's so, I think, manifestly can be shown to do real harm to people and to communities? I'm kind of begging the question, but it's, because that's what's wanted.
And the fact that they can do this with all this legalese, which hides, I mean, just like going back to the beginning documents, we, the people, only meant we, the land owning white male, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And it's that legalese, it's that abstractions of words. When you say that it's not very clear what they mean by this network readiness being a measure of liberty. Well, it's when we were talking a little bit earlier about entering into a fantasy world that somebody has created. What did they create it with? Well, they created it with abstract words, with things that don't actually have a empirical referent, as they say in linguistics. They don't have something that the word is referring to in the real world. We can talk about unicorns all day, and my herd of unicorns up on the mountain. But you really can't do much with those unicorns. Unfortunately, when a lot of people believe in the unicorns, if it's not just one nut, then if everybody says they're there, now we start to act and talk like they're real. And that's what's going on in this fantasy world of international trade and domestic trade and monetary and financial theory and the rest of it. Abstracting, very much like extracting, is destructive. It takes us away from the reality and distracts us from what's in front of us. We wonder why people vote against their own best interests, because there's not really anything of their own real interest being offered. And it's the abstractions that seem to be offered. I don't know if that helped or muddied it even more.
I like when you reframe stuff or give examples. It's very helpful. Thank you.
I'm just struggling to make sense of it myself. But thanks for the questions. And so where are we? Okay, we're going to move on to the next section unless there's other thoughts, comments. And the next section is titled Free Trade is About Free Labor. Alexander Hamilton's scheme for centralizing ownership of land and resources and building an empire on the backs of the poor has been internationalized. Debtors around the world wish they had the same social and political rights as the people from whom they borrow. They wonder why the people with enough to lend have the upper hand in governance over those without enough to get by. Their curiosity was anticipated over 2 millennia ago by Aristotle, who said, quote, oligarchy is when men of property have the government in their hands. Democracy, the opposite, when the indigent and not the men of property are the rulers, end quote. The rancor over austerity programs being imposed in the growing list of nations echoes the outrage that followed 2 years after ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Quick on the heels of Hamilton imposing his anti-democratic domestic excise taxes to pay speculators in nationalized war debt, settlers in western Pennsylvania revolted. Historians continue to condescendingly refer to the insurrection as the Whiskey Rebellion, but it was regular folk who somehow could see through the fantasy that was just a new one then. They had a real connection to the real world, and they revolted because they said, this is enslaving the commoners in order to make profit for the investors. And back to your point about the obligation of to give a return on investments. Debt as a globalized form of privileged property transfers ownership of human work, community services, natural resources, and self-governance to the owners of debt. According to a 2012 Economic Times report, defunding domestic programs and public services to pay the interest on national debt to owners of that debt is a growing international trend. In Portugal, the IMF and other European countries agreed to a financial bailout of 78 billion euros on condition that Portugal cut the wages of workers in public services, raise income taxes, and cut the military budget. In Italy, where in 2011 the public debt was around 120% of GDP and interest rates on the debt were escalating, public salaries frozen and public jobs were drastically reduced. Pensions were cut, healthcare fees were raised, as were income taxes for top brackets. In the Irish Republic, a bailout of 85 billion euros by the IMF and European countries required a minimum wage cut for workers, 5% cut in wages for public sector workers, a 25% increase in capital gains, severe cuts to welfare and child benefits, a cigarette tax, and a water tax. In Greece, austerity measures that met with widespread protest included spending cuts, a public sector hiring freeze, and an increase in the retirement age. In Spain, the country's austerity program for paying back international loans included tax increases, cuts in pay for civil servants, a 30% cut in infrastructure spending, a 28% tobacco tax, a freeze on raises for public employees, and a lowering of department budgets of almost 7%. In Germany, the austerity measures included a reduction in military personnel by 40,000, reduction of civil servants by 10,000, and new taxes on nuclear power. In the United Kingdom, austerity measures amounting to, quote, the biggest cuts in state spending since the Second World War included 490,000 public sector jobs over 4 years, cut most department budgets by 25%, increased VAT rates, that's value added taxes, by 2.5%, and increased capital gains taxes. In the United States, as of 2018, the national debt stands at over $21 trillion. I don't even know how you imagine what that looks like. Deep cuts in social services, public employment, infrastructure, maintenance, and attempts to privatize Social Security and Medicare align with the worldwide austerity measures driven by public debt. Public policy is being driven by debt obligations. The authority to govern has been transferred from public sector to private to accommodate the rights of property stored in the privileged property of debt. These measures have proliferated globally. In the United States, rather than framing such measures as austerity policies, the American public has been heavily propagandized by political opponents of public services who characterize them as creeping socialism. It seems to be working. Millions of duped Americans demand the programs they pay for and benefit from be cut. The irony is that when public funds are withdrawn from social programs that benefit the majority, the retrenchment is justified by villainizing those with the least as takers and praising the profiting wealth hoarders for their investments in the future. But the funds withheld from the public services are redirected to pay interest on debt, to finance subsidies and tax cuts for corporate property, and to further enrich the wealthy minority who have never worked for any of it. Civilization is built on a pyramid scheme that rewards those who hoard more and more of what they have no legitimate right to own. Our culture is a Ponzi scheme that deceives participants into believing they too can cobble together a formula for living that will reward them with returns on investments exceeding exerted effort. What is rarely acknowledged is that none of it is possible without the injustice of theft from everyone else, including generations yet to be born. Our exploration of the network of laws that sustains the dictatorship of property revealed that it cannot be reformed. Adopting new regulations or elevating new leaders can't bring about the systemic change that's vital to our viability as a society and a species. Laws that encourage privatization, acquisition, and exploitation are sociopathic and anti-democratic. The community rights movement has begun to take up the necessary challenge. It's a young struggle still testing the logos of avarice for weakness and chinks. We face a global crisis that's too big for any of us to confront on the planetary scale. That's why we need to adopt a rational strategy in which each of us strives in the places where we live to wrest control from the legal and cultural machinery of raw greed. We know that greed will not surrender without a colossal fight. We have few options. Daunting as the task may appear, Our lives must be devoted to this struggle since so many lives depend on it. It's our challenge to establish an economy of life and justice and an end to privilege and exceptionalism for the hoarding minority. The place to begin is in our communities. Following the example of hundreds of others who have enacted local community bills of rights and who are engaged in other actions and alternate systems, you can assert in your own community the right of local self-government, the right of local community self-determination, recognizing that it's a right limited only by the absolute reverence for the rights of others. We have to maintain that balance. For the community rights movement to triumph, one hometown after another has to take a stand. And I'm going to just leave off reading. And let's talk about this a little bit. And we're going to cover the conclusion next month. But I wanted to get away from the text here and just see if we can talk a little bit about what we've covered so far in the book. Anything that stands out for you, not just about tonight's reading, but yeah, certainly focused on this. It's been internationalized. And for me, I noticed that it's that institutionalization of oppressive systems that makes them so hard to dislodge. That the fact that, well, they're beyond our reach. You know, the international tribunals that can look at your local laws or your state's laws or the US laws and go to court and sue to have those laws overturned. This is international trade. This is commerce. This is the so-called private sector dictating to the public sector what their laws will be. It's upside down. The theory of a democratic governance was originally that it was the people, we the people, who would be able to govern and decide on the limits of commercial behaviors. These days, we're told if you put limits on commercial behavior, you're violating the fundamental rights of corporate property, which has the status of a legal person. I'm not sure. What do you think? To me, when I think about this setup, how is it any different from the idea of, say, in England or any of those nations with monarchies, where there's the nobility, the so-called noble class, the fact that they're born into certain families, they automatically get extra rights, extra privileges that the rest of the community, that the commoners can't even imagine. And we have this story we tell ourselves in the United States that says we ended all that. We got rid of the aristocracy. We got rid of the monarchy. We got rid of this whole idea of a hierarchical system of governance. Well, others might argue, well, there's always going to be hierarchy. There's always going to be a pecking order. In society, perhaps. One might think that when it comes to governance, especially governance that was declared established by we the people, that it could be different. That when it comes to the exercise of public power, that could be exercised on behalf of all of us, rather than for the emolument of a few. Let me hear your thoughts. Hahnemann?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. No, I hear the outrage. I feel the distress and the anger about the way things are. And I guess my issue is with how can we really make it better? We can see all the really amazing things that you have uncovered, which I really appreciate. And it's shocking and at the same time, not feeling there's a whole lot of power and a whole lot of time. I agree with Aristotle and the difference in the oligarchy and the democracy. And we, as far as I can tell, we don't live in a democracy. And we've been at this for a number of years here in Virginia. And I just find it really frustrating and needing some answers and some power. Thank you.
Sure. And I'll very quickly respond. I don't think there's a quick fix for it, but I think that we do have to be engaged for the long haul. And we have some examples historically that we can look at. Even someone like Václav Havel when they were trying to overturn, or get rid of the Soviet control of their country. They set up kind of freestanding alternate systems in their communities. They ignored the official and they set up their own ways of doing things, of making decisions locally and so forth. They said, we know we have these rights, we're going to act on that, and that's the way it's going to be. I know that doesn't necessarily immediately get rid of the oppressors, but one of the constants in the study of these regimes is when their authority or their legitimacy is withdrawn by the people, a significant portion of the people, collapse. They depend on our really on our going along with it. They depend on us being complicit. And our complicity often comes from fear, not because we agree with them, but because we're afraid. And really, I think sometimes it comes down to, when do you hit the tipping point where your fear is overtaken by whether it's outrage or a sense of justice or whatever it is? Comfortable people generally aren't rebellious. So they'll keep us comfortable as long as they can.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm thinking that, like, the political, economic assessments of where we're at and the psychological, spiritual, anthropological assessments need to be joined, because there's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen. Primarily, I'm thinking about scarcity and abundance. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about the mindset of abundance in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I know I tend to idealize indigenous cultures, be that as it may. I understand that the world is looked upon as providing plenty, everyone has enough. But in our culture, the general culture, it's never enough. And people, so to shift a little bit, in Buddhism and in some psychologies, there's an understanding of dissatisfaction, sometimes called suffering. It just comes with the territory of being alive. And so consumer capitalism does not want to tolerate that, let alone embrace it as a part and parcel with being alive. So I think that's where the greed comes from. It's not like greed is the rock bottom catalyst. It's underlying greed is the sense of not enough, I'll starve. As there was pervasive scarcity for thousands of years. But yeah, so we're always being sold new and improved products. We don't need them. We God is good enough. Thank you.
Sure. And real quick, just to respond, it reminds me, I think of that when you talk about there's never enough. It's like someone who's addicted to an opiate. There's never enough. There's never enough. And so it's an addiction and a real illness. And maybe it's a trick of the language, but it seems to me ironic that materialism is substance abuse, literally. Literally. Materialism is substance abuse. Funny that we kind of latched onto that phrase, substance abuse, for addictions. Well, that's materialism in a nutshell to me. And it helps me to kind of encapsulate what is this dynamic going on. And I think that it is, I mean, you'll find CEOs of huge corporations that might be delightful people to be around, you know, and have nice families and treat their dogs well and all of those things, but they are still addicted to this drive, and not only individually addicted, they may not even be individually, but the system itself. You know, as was said earlier, that the law compels the corporation to return to make decisions based on the greatest return for investors. That's it. It's like a computer program. The computer can't program itself, and the system can't program itself. The system's been programmed, and the program is make as much money for investors as you can, period. That's it. No
Every
other.
quarter, quarter,
Okay.
and there should
Right.
not be a quarter without. Yeah, it's always more. No, it's manufactured lack. Like there's this basic dissatisfaction that like no one gets everything that they want, but then there's this added on manufactured lack.
I see a couple more hands up. I think Tom and then Terry. Is that the right? Okay. Tom, you're on mute.
Okay, so I had to change from my laptop because I was getting a weak signal. But anyway, so this is my real digs. As you've gone through this, Ben, I put together a lot of dots, and this, I don't know what the time limit is here, but it's going to take me a few minutes to connect them for people. And but for background, for 35 years in the Shenandoah Valley, Front Royal, Winchester, if you've been down 81, that's the territory. I was a regional planner beginning in '73, and I retired in 2008, just at the time the economy was going down the toilet. And up in my entire career, I had believed the economists, you know, profit will solve all problems, and government's role is to plan and help achieve these goals. And then I started to read the economists and found out they really didn't know anything, and that the profit motive really didn't solve all problems, but it was more the people themselves in community motive. So I think it was a bit after I got your material, Ben, about this perspective on what the Constitution had actually, what the Federalists had actually created, that I also ran into Corey Robin, who's talks about reactionary conservatism. And, you know, one of the, as a Midwestern Lutheran, taught about the stewardship and all of that, stewardship of nature, the question of why aren't the conservatives conservationists? You know, if they were really conservative, surpluses are hard to build, you'd conserve them and use them wisely. So
you might think that.
You would
you might think that, but I think that it's just a twist of semantics.
Well, but that's what Corey Robin explains. He wrote a book in 2013 about the reactionary conservative mind, and he's recently updated it to, and it had only gone up to Sarah Palin, and he updated it up to 45. I don't like to say the gentleman's name, I just talk about 45. And how the conservative movement began as a reaction to the French Revolution. And it was the conservatives who wanted hierarchical power. So in hierarchical power, there's always somebody below you, and if you have some power, then including the men as head of household, there's still power. So it's the reactionary conservative movement would take the language of the democratic movements and co-opt it and return. So the whole reactionary thing is doing exactly, so he didn't specifically speak of how the formation of the United States was a reactionary move by conservatives to keep in control of slavery, which is something Gerald Horne hit on years ago. That is antithetical. But again, what your book did, Ben, was explain how we went from the Declaration of Independence to the Federalist system, which all of a sudden put wealth in control. And the way the system has managed this, I think it goes to the Wilson administration. Their emphasis as a counter to communism was home ownership. So everybody should be a property owner, and then they'd all buy in to the property rules. So again, I think there's a lot of, and then in the global economy, post World War II, there's an analyst named Peter Zion, who's talking about how the United States enabled free world trade as a response to the Soviet threat. And a lot of countries were able to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do as part of this global chain. And global capital is very mobile. It'll go wherever it can get the lowest price. So a lot of countries became part of the economic system, growing the crop that made them the most money rather than the wheat or whatever had kept them alive in the world. And then now this is all falling apart. So we're really in a situation where if the economy shrinks to what's sustainable, which is way less than what we have, but the debts perpetuate, there's not going to be a way to right the wrongs and to put local control of resources, but in a network where we share that.
Well, let me pause you a second, because that debt, you can say that, oh, well, if we're not creating as much stuff, we'll never pay off the debt. That debt isn't something real. It's not a rock sitting out there. It's numbers. It's a ledger. And somebody is saying, well, you owe me this much. Well, how much is owed is also in the context of usury, that there is a percentage of return that's demanded. And that's, simple, complex usury, maybe it is. But seriously, if the economy slows down, the debt remains. There used to be the idea, someone brought it up on a past session, about Jubilee, the idea of debt forgiveness. How can you just forgive debt? Well, it's hard to now because we've monetized it. We've turned debt into a commodity, which had never been done until more recent times. Debt as a commodity, seriously? That's like making the number 0 into a commodity, or or whatever. The other thing I wanted to mention to just say that competition for rank in a hierarchical system is nothing new in our country. And it's not just confined to the oligarchs. It's also people who identify themselves as the educated progressive class, who really, in many ways, support the oligarchy. They're the professionals who make the wheels keep turning. It's the so-called what was it during the pandemic? The indispensable workers, or whatever the term was. The folks that go out and actually do the hard work day in and day out. How can they do something to elevate their status in this hierarchy? Well, they can be racist and hate people that don't look like them. Shit rolls downhill, as the old saying goes. We have a system, the problem being we have a system that has institutionalized that hierarchy and made it extremely difficult not to stay in the one you were born into. Upward mobility, I'm not arguing for upward mobility either. Upward mobility assumes a system that keeps expanding and gobbling up more and more resources. Indigenous ways of life don't generally have that kind of social hierarchy. They have roles, sure. They have people that fill different roles within that setting. But it's not so much about lording it over each other. And why is there a need to lord it over each other? It's about protecting what you got. I got mine, I got mine. Stay away from it. Leave it alone. So many of our laws are about protecting the privileges and the property of those who have it against those who don't. And our prisons are erected to house those who don't have and try to get outside of the rules of the market. And that's where we put them. I mean, it's a pretty solid system. And it has its own internal logic, but it doesn't have much internal justice is the problem.
Well, I understand that. So, but and both sides are wrong. I mean, those that believe you can do good and do well at the same time. So the Democrats are no better off in their illusions than the conservatives, and that's why the working class people who haven't technically made any gotten a raise since 1970, they're very upset, and nobody really has a solution for them. So
yes, they do. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm pushing back to say the solutions are known. They're just not allowed.
Well, I'd like to hear that if you could summarize that, or is that the next session?
Well, in terms of solutions, you have to get rid of the system that's not allowing them.
Right, and that's where my point is. You need total collapse to the point that the debt on the books disappear. Because if you look at our world now, there are people that are trying to cash in on bonds and property claims from 1918 and all this other stuff. So the thing is, it all needs to die and be forgotten, and then start from zero.
Well, the good or bad news, it all will die and be forgotten eventually.
I believe so, yes.
Because it doesn't exist in the real world.
Well, we don't live in.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm
Sure.
sorry. We could dive into this pretty deeply, but I want to respect Terry. You've had your hand up all this time, so let me go to you.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion. And it's kind of funny. I was just watching this video, and I learned something new, which is it was Tucker Carlson talking with Jimmy Dore, the comedian, and Tucker was saying that the taxes that are on income, that is workers, is twice as much as the taxes on stocks and investments and you know, that's what we're talking about here, is like the laws have reinforced the powers that be's values and what works for them, and screwed everybody else over, right? And I so relate to with the woman who's speaking earlier about, you know, things, this scarcity mentality, and the debt mentality goes with that too. And I really believe that what they're doing at this point is they are trying to humiliate us, to take our power away from us so that we won't stand up and say no. Because the truth is that each of us as individuals is so powerful. We have abilities that they actually don't have. I mean, I've worked my entire life, you know, they have not. You know, they got everything handed to them, and they only have one playbook. I've seen that over and over again. They have one playbook and they keep doing the same play, whereas we have creativity. They don't have spirituality either. We have that. Those are powers and qualities inside of us that we can, all we have to do really is stand up and say, no, I'm not playing that game. I'm not complying. I'm doing it differently. And their power goes away. I mean, there's so many more of us than there are of them. There's like 300 of them or something, right? So yeah, that, and like another thought that really came up as I was listening to this discussion is I live in the Bay Area in California, and you know, when the president of China came to visit recently, and our governor Gavin Newsom magically disappeared all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of homeless people in San Francisco in one night. He ended homelessness in one night. This man has been talking about getting rid of homelessness for decades. Last year we had this surplus budget of like $50 billion or something. This year we're 68 billion in the hole, or just as much, you know, and which reminds me about our debt, national debt. You know, the paper that you wrote said 21 trillion, but now it's like 35 trillion, you know, and growing by the second. And, you know, what does that do to your mindset when you know that you have that much debt? And even the children that are not born yet will inherit that debt. That is that's a way to keep us from changing the system.
What would you do?
Up, right?
What would you do if someone, you know, someone from the bank called and said, you owe us $1 million?
Well,
You'd say, no, I don't. How did I incur that?
Yeah.
And you would refuse to pay it, and
Yeah.
you would dig your heels in. Well, the debt, the borrowing that is done in order to wage wars here and there and all over the place, and to station troops all over the globe, and have that not come out of the general funds, where does it come from? Your grandchildren are going to pay for it. You know, I mean, it's, and how did they incur that debt? By being valueless to the system.
Right. Right.
And in my mind, they have every right to simply reject it and say, not my problem.
Yeah, and there are laws that will uphold that as well. I just read this book, Fruit from a Poisonous Tree. You know, it talks about how we don't need to pay taxes. We don't need to support this system that's set up the way that it is. There are alternatives. If we owe debt, there are ways that we can say, no, that honestly, that's not my debt. That's your system. That's, you know, and we can actually change things around so that we don't owe that, really, technically. You know, we have inalienable rights that were given to us by God, you know, a power greater than any man on this earth, you know, even though they think that they're more powerful, and they think that they can replace all of us with robots or whatever, you know, and that we don't have any value. That's how they see us. But that's that's not the truth. And if everyone remembers who they really are and the power that they really have, I personally think that's what can change everything. It's just people knowing their own power and honoring it and standing up and claiming it. You know, I really think that that can change everything in the situation that we are in right now.
I think you're suggesting, kind of coming full circle back to, what reality do we want to live in? What world?
That's right.
If a better world is possible, which one do you want to be possible? And what are you going to do to get there? And it can't be sitting down and watching TV.
That's
and
right.
It can't be going along with the flow. It's got to be something else.
Yeah.
I'm good. I know we're out of time here, but I also see another hand up.
There's a couple more. Yeah.
Oh, two more hands up. Okay.
And I want to use your quote about addiction and materialism, because I so believe that it's true. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I talk?
Yes, please.
Great, thanks. I really appreciate the book, your description, your history. I think you've defined the problem really good, really well. And so I would like to move to concrete and get out of abstraction. And I would like to know from Ben or those people who have experience with community rights movements, can you share stories about how individuals have been transformed? I mean, we're all colonized within this system, and it's getting outside of it is a process. So for individuals to know your power, or individuals in groups, I think is more likely that you get to feel your power outside of this, whether you're a tax resistor or whatever you are, to take on a corporation. Can you share stories from individual people that have been transformed? Can you share stories about individual groups that actually came together and took on particular corporations, and what were the issues? And I want the stories of how people get transformed, because I think we defined it well. We all know what we're facing, and I want to be around those people that are doing something.
And doing it too, right? Yeah, because and we have the stories. Don't have time for 'em much right now, but we have stories to tell, and maybe our next month gathering will be the conclusion for this series. But maybe rather than going through the text so much, we'll talk about those things. What direction do we need to go? And I don't think that most people know this stuff. That what we've covered throughout the book, I didn't know it when I began 20 years ago when I started organizing in communities. I didn't know a lot of these things, and most people don't. The reason that it's been presented in a book and on this series is to make it more visible. It's an invisible dynamic system that's ruining our communities and our planet. And there are communities that have taken a stand. But we need more. We need many more, and we need to find the strategy that is going to get there. We've in the past approached it one community at a time, making local law that challenges the existing structures that are oppressive. We know, we've concluded after lots of trials in this way, that the system will never agree, will never capitulate. The courts will never see it our way. And we know that. But going through the exercise was the only way for some communities, some people, for them to arrive at the conclusion that the system really is rigged top to bottom, that it is rigged in such a way that it will not allow people without wealth to call the shots, make decisions. So we do have communities that learned those lessons in, kind of a baptism by fire, as they say, went through the thing, got slapped down, learned the lesson, and now they know that. I'm not the one who can say what people will do. we can make suggestions. And I can tell stories, and Michelle's here, she can tell stories, and the rest of our staff as well. And some of you know the story of like Grant Township. Some of you know stories of our Ohio communities that have stood up, and the Great Lakes, or the Lake Erie Bill of Rights that was enacted by more than 60% of the voters in Toledo, Ohio, only to be overturned by one agribusiness corporation who said its rights were being violated. What about the rights of the 60% of the voters in Toledo, Ohio? Their rights are subordinate to the rights of an agribusiness corporation, which is a type of property. The fact is that there are people out there and ready to do something about it. And the question is, how ready are we? I'm going to pause it there because we are out of time, but I see that Sabine, you're up next and you have a question, so I want to respect that. You're on mute.
I think that one issue that is really in the middle of all this is the Citizens United decision that really, in my view, legalizes corruption. And because, I mean, we as voters don't have really a lot of power anymore, because the corporations can basically pay they are paying the politicians, and that is the case everywhere where you may be fighting in any organization, like, for example, environmental organization or women's rights or healthcare, whatever. And I think you may put in a lot of energy and fight for years, but you always kind of run your head against the wall. And I think unless that may be just a first step, but I think that may be one that all these organizations should focus on, because as long as corporations can determine what bills are being passed, and so we have no chance. And I think that should be a first step to and it is possible.
Well, we have talked about the Citizens United decision in past sessions, and you are right that it's been a real curse on any kind of democratic process. But it's not getting rid of that decision, overturning it would not fix the problem. It would make it, it would make it possible to pass laws to limit corporate donations or to even outlaw them. The McCain-Feingold Act was passed. It illegalized the kind of corporate money in politics that we see now. And then it was challenged and overturned. And the Supreme Court, in a subsequent decision with the Citizens United decision, opened the floodgates. But actually, the floodgates had been mostly opened in 1978 with the Bellotti case that gave corporations so-called free speech rights and said that money was speech. The Citizens United was just like the icing on the cake, but it's the one that everybody knows about. But all of the rights that supposedly are applied to corporations by the courts, that began long, long ago. And if you read the book that I wrote, it gives you that story. And it's also available online. You can look up, and I'm off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. We had it on our website, but there are timelines for the development of through the Supreme Court's decision, the increased development of rights for corporations under the Bill of Rights. started back with the Dartmouth case, and then in 1886 with Santa Clara, and it goes on and on with Hobby Lobby giving religious freedoms to inert, dead property. I don't know how you do that, but somehow you do. You get to live in somebody's fantasy world again. And here we are. So I appreciate that, your comments on that. And yes, we should overturn the Citizens United decision. But if we do, we won't hardly notice the difference.
Oh. Yeah, I will explore that further. Thank you.
Yes, more. I think just to respect everyone's time, we should close it off.